Hey class, so this week is going to be all about building your evaluation metrics. So remember, the next step after you have identified your problem in practice and created your research question is to start creating a tool to gather data about your research question and your problem in practice. So this is going to be the first week of a 2-week cycle where we're going to be learning how to create these evaluation metrics, these program evaluation metrics. This week, we're going to focus on how to identify and develop the content of your program evaluation tool. And then next week, you'll learn how to take that content and turn it into valid and reliable questions that are all organized in a tool to evaluate your problem in practice and collect data on it. So this week, our learning objectives are to understand the concepts of validity and reliability. That's going to be a brief discussion. And the majority of this video is about learning how to develop an item bank. So what an item bank is, in the process of identifying evidence-based practices related to your independent variable in your research question to create that item bank. So we'll talk about what the item bank is, what it contains, and how to make one. So in order to collect data for your problem in practice, you're going to need your evaluation tool, as I just mentioned. Before we get into the content of this week, I want to talk with you about the steps or the blueprints that you're going to be following in order to create your entire program evaluation tool. So this is what we're going to be covering over the next 2 weeks together. So first, just to remind you again, what the evaluation tool is it's going to consist of questions that gather data about the implementation of practices, programs, and services related to your independent variable, as well as potential implementation factors. So in order to make your program evaluation tool, you're first going to have to identify which practices, programs, and services related to your independent variable are the ones that you want to gather data about. Then you'll identify characteristics such as frequency that you want to gather data on for each practice. So how often does each practice occur? You'll write objective questions about each practice to ask participants to provide data about the characteristic you're interested in. So if you're interested in frequency, you'll write a question that asks your participants to share about the frequency of a practice. You'll then identify factors that impact the implementation of the practices, programs, and services that you've identified. Finally, you're going to have to identify characteristics of those factors. So are you talking about the level of adaptability, a level of knowledge or skills? And you'll be writing questions for those factors as well. So this is what you're going to learn how to do over the next 2 weeks. What we're going to learn about this week is simply identifying practices, programs, and services related to your independent variable and factors that impact the implementation of those practices as they relate to your problem in practice. So just identifying practices, programs, services, and factors. No question writing this week. We're not going to be talking about how to build out those characteristics and questions until next week. Okay, so over the next 2 weeks, it's going to be really important to have key terminology down in order to be able to talk about how we're building these tools. It'll just make our conversations a lot faster and easier. So while we try to keep the research jargon down, in this class, there are some things that we'll really just have to keep clear in our mind for terminology. So the first thing I want to do is just to rehash what your components of your research question are. Many of you have now seen this for beyond this class. I'm sure you have experience with those terms as well. And you all have demonstrated just how well you can create these in your 2.1 organizers, but I just want to make sure and rehash them again. So remember that your independent variable is the practice, program, or service that influences an outcome in your problem in practice. This is the thing we want to improve so that our outcomes improve. The outcome is a dependent variable because it changes as a result of changing the independent variable. So you've got a practice, a program, or a service, some domain of practice. Let's give an example of my domain is work study, and I want to improve work study. When I do that, the outcome of it is that my students, I have a higher percentage of my students gaining competitive integrated employment when they graduate my program. So that's my dependent variable. The independent variable is work study. It's what we do to provide work study for students. A characteristic, which we'll talk a lot more about next week, is a feature or quality belonging typically to practices associated with the independent variable. So this is a characteristic in the sense of it's a feature or quality of the independent variable and the practices that are aligned with it. So an example is frequency of occurrence or duration. And factors can also have a characteristic. So the level of adaptability. So is there high levels of adaptability to the needs of young people? Is there minimal, right? So we can think about different scales for that. So characteristics, we're going to keep talking more about them over the next 2 weeks. You'll see a lot of examples. But these are things like frequency, effectiveness, duration. We'll talk a lot about other options too. Items. These are the questions on evaluation tools. That's why we're talking about item banks. This is a question bank. But this week, we're just talking about getting the content that will become the questions. That's our item bank. So the item bank, more specifically, is once you've identified all of these practices, programs, services, and factors, an item bank is all of those practices and factors related to your independent variable, each having specific definitions based upon the literature. We call these operationalizations. So you've operationalized or defined the key essential characteristics of each practice that you've identified in terms of what aligns with your independent variable. Qualitative within the context of this class is written responses. Quantitative is numerical data such as scores and ratings. And we'll talk a lot more about that next week. Participants are someone who completes the evaluation metric, and fidelity is when a practice is implemented according to how research has shown it should be implemented in order to result in a particular outcome. So there is a particular way to implement, for example, modeling for complex chain behaviors. There are a few ways to do that, right? And there's literature on that. And by following the way it's been designed and identified in the literature in terms of evidence-based practice, you'll have a greater likelihood of your own clients or students increasing their knowledge and skills through you implementing that practice versus if you took the practice and just implemented it your own way. That's not to say that we're always modifying, of course, and differentiating to meet our students' needs, but that's the idea of fidelity, that there's a specific way to do something because doing it that way has been shown through research to result in particular outcomes, and the extent to which you do it the way it was identified in the literature is fidelity. All right, let's have a brief conversation as we continue this terminology cheat sheet here about reliability and validity, because these are two really important topics that we'll be talking about in terms of question design more next week, but this is our kind of our introduction to them. So reliability, each question on your metric consistently measures something. It doesn't mean that it measures what you want it to measure. So you had in your mind that you wanted this question to measure a particular practice. Let's say I wanted to measure the frequency of the use of direct modeling in my community-based instruction. So that's what I want to measure. Sometimes my question may measure that. Other times it may not. But when my question doesn't measure that at all, but it measures something else consistently, we would say that it is not valid, because validity is the extent to which the question measures what we want it to measure, And reliability is that it's measuring something consistently. So if I had this question and I wanted to know about how often a particular instructional method is used to support students in developing their occupational skills, I'm just giving some random examples. And my question, instead of measuring what I wanted, it measures something else consistently. So that means that the question is worded in a way that it's unclear to participants. It's the question that you have given for participants makes them think you're asking them something else than what you wanted to ask them. And that consistently happens. So you're consistently causing participants to provide you data that isn't related to what you actually are trying to measure. Validity is that you've measured exactly what you wanted to measure. So you wanted to know a specific characteristic, duration, let's say, about a particular practice, let's say the use of interest inventories. And your question is written in a way so any of your stakeholders who take that survey and answer that question are going to be clearly they know, and they are providing you a response regarding the measurement of how often interest inventories are being used, how often they're doing it. So of course, we want to have both of these things, reliability plus validity. We want to always measure what we want to measure, and we want to measure what we want to measure, right? So that's how they come in together. And I have these visual representations for you here to kind of drive that point home too. So if we don't have reliability and validity, we end up with arrows all across the dartboard there. They're not hitting their target and they're not hitting the same spot at the same time. So you can see in that last example, they're all over the place, right? Versus being reliable and valid, meaning that you're always measuring exactly what you want to measure. So next week, you'll learn how to create questions that accomplish these goals. This week, you're going to be deciding which practices, programs, and services and factors are going to become the questions that you'll create next week to be valid and reliable. So this is just a visual representation of how we're getting from week 1 of 2.1 for your assignment to 2.2 and then 2.3. So you can see here, you started off in week 1 with identifying your problem practice and your research question. That was in 2.1 of your organizer. And you identified your independent variable, dependent variable, population, and context. Assignment 2.2, which is this week, is you're making your item bank. So you're identifying practices, programs, services, and implementation factors related to your independent variable, and more broadly, your research question for your problem and practice. After this week, you're going to take that item bank, and in assignment 2.3, you'll learn how to create an online program evaluation tool where you're going to be creating questions to measure characteristics of each of the practices that you've identified as being critical to knowing about when you're going to make your data-driven recommendations later this semester. So you can see the week 1 is all about contextualizing and forming your research. And then this week and next week are all about program evaluation tool development. All right. So let's start. This whole process is going to go in steps. I want to show you how to do step 1 of creating your evaluation metric tool. So the first thing we have to do to make our evaluation metric is to create an item bank. And I'm using the word metric. That's another word for a data collection tool. So an evaluation metric is an evaluation tool that collects data about a practices, programs, services, and implementation factors. So you're going to create an item bank, right? This is what we just saw on that previous slide. So what is an item bank? An item bank is a list of practices, programs, services, and implementation factors, as I've been talking about, that are related to your independent variable. I know I'm just rehashing this, but to get that clear in our mind, will make it easier as we're starting to identify and build these out. So Each of the practices represents an item that's going to become a question in your 2.3 organizer next week. And each item in the bank is given a definition according to the research literature. So item banks are really defined by their process. So you start off with a list of overarching domains of practice. This list here is from Rowe et al. 2015 from the Adelphi study to operationalize predictors of post-school success. So this Rowe article that we're going to be using a lot this semester, and now you've become a little familiar with here from your 2.1 assignment, we're going to first start off with a list of overarching domains of practice. This is the list you'll be using. So we're going to look at those overarching domains of practice. From that, we're going to acknowledge that each of those domains of practice contain related practices, programs, and services, right? So career awareness, there are practices, programs, and services within that bucket. Each of these contains sub-practices. So I have an example here. If we take career awareness, 2 examples of related practices, programs, and services are embedded career awareness in the general curriculum to teach about occupations and relating that and integrated into core content areas, of course, if it's built into the general curriculum, and also providing systematic age-appropriate transition assessments, student assessment, for career awareness. So interest inventories, aptitude tests, preference tests, for students to learn about their preferences and aptitudes for various types of careers. We often align those, right, with the 16 career clusters. But so these are 2 examples of career awareness practices. So we're disentangling, we're pulling apart career awareness of this overarching domain into its subparts here. That's our second step. The next part is that we're going to take those practices and acknowledge that they're organized within domains according to subdomains. So the domain is career awareness. The practices we have are these 2 here related to curriculum and assessment. And you can see how I have them color-coded, where assessment and curriculum are part of these subdomains of practice. So we've got assessment, instruction, curriculum, and collaboration. These are the subdomains that you're going to be organizing your practices within. We then have a list of overarching domains of factors. So we're going to be looking at inner setting, outer setting, process, and individual characteristics. We're going to specify factors within these 4 categories related to the practices. So we've got these practices related to, in this example, assessment and curriculum, and we're looking at specific factors that influence the implementation of using systematic age-appropriate transition assessment related to career awareness and career awareness in the general curriculum. We're going to look at specific factors that influence those 2 things being done with fidelity. And then we combined these 2 together. So we've got these list of practices that are defined, and they're organized into these subdomains of assessment, instruction, curriculum, and collaboration, 1 or more of those. And we're going to combine that in a chart called an item bank that contains the practices and their definitions and factors, which are also defined, that are most likely to influence their implementation. All right, let's talk about how to create your 2.2 organizer from scratch, step by step. You'll need to have open your 2.2 organizer, of course. You'll have to have open the Adelphi study from Rowe, 2015. This document is in the Transition Research Library under the folder assignments, articles for assignment 2.2. And it's right here. So you're going to download that. Then you'll head over to the implementation factors folder. and open up the C for constructs in your browser here. And once you've got those things open, leave this open because you might have to come in here. You'll definitely have to come in here actually to pull out one or more articles that'll help you develop your 2.2 organizer. Okay, let's talk about the directions first for this assignment. So what you're going to be doing is identifying effective practices, programs, and services, right? As we've talked about many times now, from research articles in the Transition Research Library in our Blackboard course. Your goal is to have between 10 and 15 individual practices, programs, and services that are aligned with your independent variable. So what I mean by that is that each of these rows represents a practice. If we go back to our slides, what I'm talking about are these practices that are related to overarching domains, the overarching domain being your independent variable. So I've got career awareness as my independent variable, and I've got these two practices identified for this example. One is related to curriculum, one is related to assessment. So the practices themselves are right here in this first row. And then the domains that they go in are right here. So these are the subdomains that they go in are right here. So in my example on the 2.2 organizer that you all have, I have progress monitoring under the domain of work study. So that's from row. We look at row over here. So right here, that's one of the predictor categories from row. So that's my domain, which is also my independent variable. I have progress monitoring, which is a practice. The subdomain, it's related to assessment and instruction. Okay, so we're kind of seeing where those components are. So each of those practices that you identify are going to be aligned with one or more of those subdomains that are listed. But you might be asking yourself at this point, well, how do I identify these practices, right? How do I know what to choose? So what you're going to do is once you have your research question, you're going to take your independent variable and say, so this example is my independent variable is related to work study. That's the predictor category from row that it aligns with most. Okay. I'm going to go into row. I'm going to look at work study. I'm going to look at the definition and all of the essential characteristics, and I'm going to develop a description of the essential characteristics of evidence-based practices for this domain. Who does them, where, what, when, how, all of that, but directly related to your problem in practice. So what you're not going to do is go here and copy and paste them in. It won't help you because what your purpose here is to write a thick, full description of all of the essential characteristics of that domain of practice, which is your independent variable. And then in order to identify your practices, what you'll do is look through that description step by step. And you'll have a practice in each row. I have one row here, but you'll have between 10 and 15 rows in yours of practices. And you're going to look, and it's called sampling the domain. That's a fancy way in research of saying that there are all these practices, programs, and services in that domain, and you are grabbing the most essential ones that speak to all of the most impactful, high leverage, essential characteristics of that domain of practice. So there's a million things that happen, but you're going to take a sample of the most important things as a representation of effective practice for that domain. So you're going to, in order to figure out when you have what we call saturated your domain, that you've identified practices that hit on all aspects of it, is first and foremost, you have to have a really precise, detailed description of that domain. You're going to spend the most amount of your time in the beginning writing this description to be hyper specific, to have all of those essential characteristics. So you're going to be looking at row. You're also going to be looking within one or more articles that are provided here, the article you choose depends on what your domain is, right? Your independent variable, which is your domain, as aligned with row. So whatever your independent variable aligns with over here, occupational courses, whatever it may be, is your domain. So you're going to spend a lot of time just building out this really detailed description of the essential characteristics of that domain, of your independent variable. And then you're going to break it down, identify all of the practices, programs, and services that are most essential, right, that you've already written here. And what you're going to do is take them and then give a full research-based description of what it looks like when it's done with fidelity. So the articles will tell you that in order to do this in a way that supports positive post-school outcomes for this particular outcome, it has to be done this way. This is what literature has tested and showed works. So you're going to be writing a description of when it's done with fidelity. For this example, when progress monitoring is done with fidelity, what does it look like? It's only going to be a sentence or two. It doesn't have to be this big, long thing, but you're going to write it to be succinct and to have those essential characteristics. Once you have that, you're going to then say, okay, well, in the context of my problem and practice, what does this practice that I've identified that aligns with my description above for my domain, what is it, what subdomains does it align with? So for my problem and practice here, it aligns with assessment and instruction, because maybe my problem and practice is we've got this work study program and an 1821 program, and we want to use progress monitoring not just to understand how students are doing, but to make instructional decisions. So we're going to use data to inform and differentiate instruction. So I've got those two subdomains that it's aligned with. Then I say, okay, in the literature, what are 2 to 4 things that people do, so strategies, tools that are used related to this overarching practice here of progress monitoring, that are evidence-based, that support those efforts? So here I have types of assessment that are used for progress monitoring. So this is why we identify those subdomains. It helps us to identify the sub-practices. So I have sub-practices here related to assessment and instruction. I've got data-driven differentiated instruction. And then I have some assessment-specific only ones of task checklists, employer evaluations, and self-evaluations. And my final thing is, where did I get that information from? You're going to want to have that there too. Why? Because you many times have to go back and check to see if you've missed anything. And if you don't know where it came from, it makes it really difficult to do that. So do yourself a favor and have your references there so you know where you got it from. And then you're able to go look back and say, maybe I need to define that practice a little better for my item bank, so you can easily find it and go back. I promise if you don't have it, it becomes almost impossible to find where they came from once you're dealing with 3 articles and you've got 15 practices identified. So it'll make your life really easy. So what you're going to do is work through, once you have that detailed description, work through identifying practices that are listed in that description there. You're going to define them through the literature. You're going to identify their subdomains and their sub-practices. And then, of course, put where you got them. Build that out. You've got 10 to 15 of them. Once you've done that, you're then going to look at implementation factors for some, most, or all of those practices you've identified. So I've got progress monitor and I've got other in this first column. Maybe I've got like 9 other practices I've identified and built out in each of these rows. I'm then going to look for, according to the literature, so this is where these articles come in. These articles in their discussion sections, depending on which one you choose, depends upon what your domain is for your independent variable. But all of them in their discussion sections talk about factors that influence the implementation of these practices that are being talked about in the article. So you'll pick an article that relates to your domain and to the practices that are now fleshed out in these rows here. I have progress monitoring, but you'll have 10 to 15 of them. And once you've done that, you're then going to say, okay, what are those big, most pressing factors that influence the practices, programs, and services that I've identified? What is the literature telling me that is really impactful on this? So what you can do is bounce between the CFR constructs and these articles. So you look in the article, and for example, for progress monitoring, maybe the article says that a big factor in stakeholders using progress monitoring with fidelity, and meaning that they're not only collecting data, but they're using it to inform instruction over time. They're collecting data over time, which is called formative assessment, right? So they're continually monitoring progress by collecting student data over multiple checkpoints, and then using that data consistently, not just at the end of the year, to make decisions about instruction. So each week, let's say we're in community-based instruction. Each week we're going out into the community to practice skills and to let's just say we're going out into a grocery store and learning how to do money management and shopping and things like that, right? So each week we're going out there and we're collecting data on how well students are doing in developing these skills, mastering these skills that they've identified they want to work on in the community. And these two parts here, the literature just broadly says that in progress monitoring, what you need to do is have access to multiple sources of digestible and accurate information about how to do progress monitoring as it's been defined in terms of collecting data over time and making decisions ongoing based upon the data. You need to have access to knowledge-based resources, so professional development, self-guided learning, mentorship opportunities. So looking in the literature to say, if these things happen, if these factors happen, generally, more broadly, access to knowledge and information, that progress monitoring is more likely to be successfully implemented. So what you can do is keep open the CFR constructs and look through the articles. So get yourself familiar and look through the articles and say, all right, well, they're talking about the need for professional development. Where does that sit in the CFR framework? It's probably the inner setting, because that's something that the organization or school or agency is going to be doing for its staff or district. And then, oh, look, access to knowledge and information. Yeah, this really speaks to this idea that in order to do progress monitoring, in my example, that stakeholders need to have information available to them on how to do this well. So I'm going to click on it. I'm going to get a detailed description, and I'm going to use this description plus what I'm seeing in the literature to give a definition of this factor. So you can, like we said before, copying it is not going to help you, but reading it and contextualizing what is here according to your own problem and practice will help you. And then we're going to say, so inner setting, and what does it relate to? Which practices? It may be one, or this could be all of the practices that you've identified could be influenced by that factor. That's fine too. And then as much as possible, we want to give an example of that factor in relation to the practices. So I gave an example here of professional development on graphing performance data, identifying trends and making instructional decisions. So what you're doing here now is you're starting to build out a little bit of what you might include in a question related to progress monitoring. So this last part kind of helps you to contextualize that factor within your problem and practice. The last part too that I want to talk about, so that's how to do each of these. If you have more than one independent variable, so if you have two independent variables, you're going to have a domain for each of those. So you'll have work study, like in my example, let's say I have work study as one of my independent variables, and maybe collaboration is my other independent variable. I've got two of them. If that's the case, then I have to have practices, programs, and services for the work study domain, and I also have to have them for the collaboration domain. With that said, you still only have to have 10 to 15 practices, programs, or services, and 2 to 4 factors overall across the two domains. You don't have to do 30 and 8. Just do your 15 up to 15, and your 4 factors. So if that's the case, you might do the same 4 factors across, but you don't have to do double the work if you have multiple domains. And as much as possible, you want to split the amount of practices you have across the 2 domains. But more important than that, always, is that you have gotten a really good sampling of practices from your description that you've created up here. Okay, so that is in depth on how to do your 2.2 organizer. More importantly, you now know how to develop an item bank based upon the literature. So this is what you're going to be working on for your 2.2 assignment. And that concludes this first video about developing your item bank. So next week, if I go back here. So we've just talked about how to identify your practices and your factors. And next week, we'll start talking about characteristics and question development for factors and practices, programs, and services. Okay. That concludes this lecture.